Hi, I'm Cory Shulman, and I am the director of the Autism Center of Hebrew University, a new perspective. And what I'm going to try to do is give you some perspectives from the past, but mostly focus on some challenges for what we can do for the future. As much as I would like to talk about the 100 years that we're focusing on, I can't do that yet because autism was coined as a diagnostic category only in 1943 by Professor Leo Kanner, a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins Hospital in New York. And in 1980, it was finally taken out of this psychiatric category of childhood schizophrenia and put into a neurodevelopmental disabilities category. So when they finish doing the brain at the Brain Center, we can give them autistic brains to do as well to see what went wrong. And since it has begun diagnostic, in 2018, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, did a very robust scientific study of the prevalence of autism in the world. And guess what? We better pay attention because they say that there is 1 in every 59 children will be diagnosed with autism. And that means that 1.7% of the entire population of the world will have autism. So we better get on this, and we better get on it quickly. We are talking about a spectrum disorder that's quite heterogeneous, and you cannot tell if someone is autistic just by looking at them. You actually have to interact with them, and even then sometimes it's hard to do it. Particularly today, when we're looking at children who we want to open up the frontiers of their minds and give them many things, and all children are really connected to their screens, it's really important for us to realize that some of it's just a qualitative difference, where we're talking about something that implicitly people should know, like to look at other people when they're talking to them. We actually have to teach them to do that. On the other hand, we have adults who have been living with autism their whole life, like Temple Grandin, who is a university professor at the University of Colorado and really bright and has spent her life being an ambassador for autism by writing autobiographical books and talking around the world. Once, when I diagnosed a child with autism who was participating in one of our research studies, and I was trying to prioritize with the mother what she really wanted for her child, thinking she wanted him to go to regular school, or in this country, to go into the army, or get married, she said, "Cory, I want for this child what I want for all my child. My child should be happy. And quality of life is based on happiness, and we should be sure that we're looking into that as well." So what are the diagnostic criteria for autism? The diagnostic criteria for autism, as of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual from May of 2013, is one disorder where the two main disabilities are an impairment in social communication and interaction, as well as restricted and repetitive behaviors. Although it is one disorder, it has many expressions. The first thing that's important to realize is that it expresses itself individually. For each child with autism, their autism is a little different. They say, if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. So we have to know what the severity of the symptoms are, from very severe, which is probably what many of us think of when we think of the child who's not interested in interaction and sits alone. But we can have that moderately, or we can even have that very mildly, where someone has autism and it impacts on their life, but they can still function. In addition, we are talking about many different levels of intellectual functioning. These can be people who have severe intellectual problems and will probably need help their entire life. But some of them also have typical cognitive abilities, but with a very different cognitive profile. And some, probably like Temple Grandin, can really be geniuses. In terms of language functioning, we have people who never develop language at all. When I started learning about autism, we were told that 50% of people with autism would never develop language. Then it went down to 30%. And now they tell us that about 15 to 20% of people with autism will never develop language. And we don't know why, because there is no physiological problem that they don't develop language, but they don't. It is now considered to be a type of autism where there is none or minimal verbal ability. In addition, we can talk about problems in pragmatics. Pragmatics are how I use and how I understand language. For example, I was sitting with a young woman and her mother, and we were discussing the young woman's diagnosis of autism, and she asked a really good question. And so I turned to her and I said, yeah, I think that's a really good idea, but that's a long answer. In our next meeting, we'll sit on a cup of coffee and we'll talk about it. And she said, don't sit on a cup of coffee. It will break, and it's wet, and it's hot, and that will be very uncomfortable on your backside. So I didn't sit on a cup of coffee. And we also have people who are authors or even linguists, because we believe that people with autism actually learn language differently, even their mother tongue. And that way they can learn languages differently. And there is one person who speaks 96 languages because he has decided that he is going to go around the world learning all the languages that there are. In terms of social functioning, we are also talking about a spectrum. And that spectrum can be from the very withdrawn child who doesn't even seem to be interested in a social connection. And then you have those people who are a little passive and a little awkward, and kind of, we all know people like that. And according to Lorna Wing, we can also find people who are active and odd and inappropriate. And many of the young men that I have been in contact with actually have been accused of stalking because they don't understand where the level goes and what's comfortable and what is not comfortable. Autism does not appear alone, for the most part. There are some times that it does. As with everything in autism, you can't ever make a generalization because whatever you say, there's going to be something that's a little different. It can come along with other syndromes of mental retardation, like Fragile X. It can come with tuberous sclerosis and epilepsy, as we were talking about earlier, and other genetic disorders. It can also come with anxiety and depression, which is really difficult for a person who doesn't necessarily understand the world and then is also depressed from that, and a lot of people with attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity. So if we're talking about something that is so heterogeneous, how do we then go ahead and understand this one disorder, multiple expressions? And what we'd like to do is actually begin subtyping. So we take some of the things I just talked about, epilepsy, psychiatric disorder like anxiety, or sensory sensitivity, and we say, how much do those things express in this group, or this group, or this group? Each one of the circles here is a different fact. We are trying to do that now in the Autism Center with higher functioning and lower functioning people across the age limits, and specifically with boys and girls. Because honest to goodness right now, as much as we'd like to think about it, we don't really understand all of the mechanisms that bring about autism. We've been trying to do this through biology, and when I began my studies in the early 1970s, I was very fortunate to work with James Simmons at UCLA, and he said, this is the most exciting time to be involved in autism research. In another 15, 20 years, we are going to know what causes autism. And guess what? We didn't. And then in 1995, I went to the University of Chicago, and I was again involved in a wonderful research project. And Dr. Edwin Cook said, in another 10 to 15 years, we're going to know what causes autism. and we don't. So what I have been doing, along with the 38 other researchers in the Autism Center at Hebrew University, is we've been studying behavior. We want to know what kinds of behaviors work where, with whom, and what does it influence. And if a particular individual with autism has intellectual development disability, how does that affect his or her autism? But what has been most promising and most important is what we are now looking for is the crossover between behavior and biology. And we believe that the biobehavioral markers will begin to tell us how the physiology and the genetics of any given individual affects the behavioral expression of his or her autism. And why is that so important to us? What we want to do, first and foremost, is to promote good care and to improve the outcome for each and every individual with autism and their family. And unfortunately, it is quite easy. There are so many interventions out there, and how do you do what? So I'm going to tell you a couple of really quick stories to give you a sense of what we're doing and how we're doing it, and that will kind of tell you where we're going. I'll first start with Yoni, who was a little boy in fourth grade, who was very bright. And today he's 30, so he was in the first classroom that was made for children with autism in a regular school more than 20 years ago. And he was so bright that he was able to learn with all the other children in all their classes, which is great for integration. But he had his little home classroom, which was 8 other students with autism, and that was where he learned social skills and went on. And if there was a problem in the typical classroom, he could come back to. But we really wanted him to have some social integration as well. So there is a period of time right before recess in the morning where the children in Israel have their 10 o'clock snack break. And that 10 o'clock snack break is a time when all the children in the classroom sit together, take out their food, and they chat. And so we decided that it was really important to let our little Yoni chat with them. And he came back to the room and he said, "I'm not staying there." Now, you might think he's not staying there because there's too much language or there's too much social interaction. But no. He wasn't going to stay there because the one thing that upset him more than language and social stuff was a lot of noise. And boy, are Israeli fourth graders noisy. So we went back and we spoke to the children, and they basically said, no, we want him to stay. And their solution was that he could sit at the teacher's desk, and whenever they were too noisy, he could stand up and say, "Too noisy," and they could be quiet again. And the whole classroom was quieter and more well-behaved until the end of the year because of him. We do have a program in the Army for very competent people with autism, again, not everyone, who are specifically good visually. And their job is to decipher and decode aerial pictures that they get around. And I'm just going to share with you that one of the commanding officers of the aerial program said that it takes a soldier with autism, on an average, a month and a half to learn how to decipher a picture, while it takes a typical soldier a year. Last thing I'm going to share with you is an adult, because autism is a lifelong problem, and we want everyone to understand that we're not just talking about children. And a family came to Israel when the parents retired with their autistic son, and they left the rest of their children in America with their grandchildren. So they traveled back and forth quite a lot, which was quite distressing for the child, and for their child, and we came up with a solution. The mom would call and say, "David, Dad and I are going to the States. You're here, we're there, we'll miss you, and you'll miss us." There was a lot more to it, but I'm cutting on this one. And then one time, Mom could not go. So she called David and she said, "Dad's going to America. You'll be here, he'll be there, you'll miss him, he'll miss you, but he's coming back. And the next day, David, who is lower functioning and lives with people with intellectual disability, called his mother and said, "Mom, Dad's in America and you're here. You must miss him and he'll miss you." And when they finished their conversation, she called me in tears, and she said that in 56 years, that was the first time he'd ever responded to her feelings. And see, maybe if he could live to be 200 years old, he'd be normal. Since we believe very much in having adults, parents involved in everything that we do, we have taken a parent training for disruptive behavior, and oftentimes the disruptive behavior is the thing that bothers most in integrating people with autism into society. And we have translated it into Arabic and Hebrew, and right now we have 9 groups around the country, 3 in Arabic, that are going around and doing this training, and we are collecting information for that. So where does this take us? Really and truly, I think it's really important to continue with everything that we heard from Edan first, to understand the relationship between behavior and biology so that we can understand the mechanisms. Right now, I am involved in looking at the connection between hormones and behavior, specifically the hormone cortisol, which is responsible for stress. And we know that we have so many people on the spectrum that also have anxiety, so we want to know what does that do together with the behavior. And we're also looking at oxytocin, which is the social hormone, and how does that affect their social behavior. In addition, if we say 1 + 1 is 2, well, that's not the case when you're talking 1 is autism and 2 attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity. That is a whole lot more than 2. So what we need to do is start identifying subgroups so that we can find the underrepresented and misdiagnosed people. And all of this is so that we can streamline and personalize intervention. If we can do it with cancer, we should be able to do it with autism. And we can only do that if we receive support from the policymakers, from the service providers, from the stakeholders, the people with autism themselves and their parents and caregivers. And most importantly, we should always remember that autism is always unique, totally intelligent, at least to them, sometimes mysterious, and we hope we can do only the best. Thank you very much.